Maggie. I'm a licensed clinical psychotherapist with degrees in psychology, theology, and marriage and family therapy, a national certification in dialectical behavioral therapy, and a national certification in integrative mental health. In this video, I'm not looking to diagnose anyone. I'm only willing to offer insight into situations like these. Hey, you guys want to know what dragons, King Arthur, and Old King Cole have in common? Well, that would be the Britons, Brittons, not the people who call themselves British today, because those are two different people. And I use the word are, not were. So we're going to talk about it. But first, let me say hi to some people. Adric is here. He says it's on. Cutting Up with the Joneses is here. Nina is here with hi and the peace sign. My favorite auntie. Adric says, let's hear it for the dancing Maggies. And Adrian Hicks is here. He says, let's go. Thank you all for being here. Now, if you stick to the end, there's going to be a part 2 where I'm going to tell you some stuff about myself, which may answer any questions that some of you may have. Because I kept saying at some point I was going to do this, so today's the day. Today is the day. Leon is in the building, super busy. Thank you for listening, Leon. Appreciate you. So let's talk about the Britons, the Brythonic. Okay, so the indigenous Brythonics in Europe referred to the pre-Celtic people of Britain and parts of mainland Europe who spoke the Brythonic language, which is a branch of a Proto-Celtic language family. They were there first. These groups were culturally and linguistically distinct from the Gaelic Celts of Ireland and Scotland. So, the Brythonic peoples migrated into Western Europe about 30,000 years ago. So, they primarily inhabited what we would call Great Britain, which is like England, Wales, and southern Scotland. Eventually in Brittany, which is in France, where they migrated to escape Anglo-Saxon invasions, and then parts of northern Spain in a place called Galicia. There's still a few Brythonic influences in that area. Okay, so the Brythonic language was distinct from the Goidelic Celtic, which is the Irish, the Scots, the Gaelic, and the Manx, and they included Common Brythonic as the master language, the ancestor of later languages. The closest language spoke today is in Wales. There are some spoken in Cornwall, so it's called Cornish. And Breton is spoken in Brittany. And then there was another language called Cumbric, which is now extinct. Can't revive that one. So the Romans occupied much of Britain from the year 43 to the year 410 of the Common Era, influencing but not erasing the Brythonic culture. So I'm going to show you. So this is a picture of the attempted Roman invasion. And so you will see on that right-hand side is a Brythonic man. The interesting thing, Anglesey, which is a little island of Wales, was very difficult for the Romans to get to. It took them a few tries. And something that is said um, from Caesar himself was that it was very intimidating. These people wore cloaks. They had blue makeup, which may be a derivative of copper, called woad. And they had chariots and fought with spears, as you can see that man uh, using spears. And because they were very used to the land, the Roman soldiers were at a default. So it took several attempts to get them. In fact, it took Caesar 4 times, 4 tries to get them. Um, Still didn't completely take over because in his own writings, he's a little bit afraid of these folks. So it was very interesting. Um, Even though the Romans claimed that land, that's why it's influencing, not erasing. They didn't really do a whole lot with it. Okay. So let me take that off. Um, After Rome withdrawed, then we have the Angles and the Saxons attempting to come in. So that's in the 5th and 6th centuries of the Common Era, and it pushed the Brythonic people farther westward into Wales and Cornwall. So they had this large area where they were, and the Angles and the Saxons pushed them into Wales and Cornwall, and some people into Brittany in France. Okay. Archaeological evidence. So we have a child that was buried at Stonehenge, and Stonehenge was built by the indigenous Brythonics. It's dated to 27,700 to maybe 29,700 years ago. And by DNA, that person was an ancient Brythonic. There are hundreds of buildings and structures and burial mounds on Anglesey, which is also called Druid Island. It is part of Wales. And then we also have Cheddar Man. Have you guys heard of Cheddar Man? Sorry, I'm trying to reorganize my chair here. Okay, so let's talk about Cheddar Man. Let's see. We're going to pull him up. Share screen. Cheddar Man. There we go. That's Cheddar Man. The man on the left is Cheddar Man. So Cheddar Man, because he was found in cheddar, not because he had anything really to do with cheese. In fact, he was lactose intolerant. So hi, Span Man. Thank you for being here. Spain Man, I say the same thing. And at the end, there's going to be a little bit of a bonus before I talk about myself that talks about this dating. Okay. So Cheddar Man is the name that was given to a 10,000-year-old Mesolithic skeleton discovered in Gow's Cave in Cheddar Gorge, England in 1903. He's one of the oldest near complete human skeletons found in Britain and has provided key insights into the genetics and the appearance of early Britons. Britons. Not the British, not the ish, but the indigenous Britons. Okay. So the DNA analysis that was done in 2018 said very dark to medium dark skin, blue eyes, and curly dark hair. And so they refigured this, they made this bust up of Cheddar Man, and certain people went nuts and said, no, he wasn't black. No, he doesn't have dark skin. And they've tried to change things up. However, the DNA doesn't lie. Okay, now the man on the right, his last name is Target. He is a Welshman who is a direct descendant of Cheddar Man. So we'll talk about that again in a little bit. So the Britons are genetically linked to Western hunter-gatherers, which is a group that spread across Europe right after the Ice Age from Mesopotamia and the Sumerian Valley. Now, for those of you who are not aware, the Natufians of Africa are the predecessors to the Mesopotamian. The Mesopotamian are Black African, and the Mesopotamians moved into the valley, which is Sumeria, and also still Black. So it would make sense that as some migrated from the Sumerian Valley into this area, that they would also still have dark skin and black curly hair. In fact, the Mesopotamians referred to themselves as the Blackheads. Okay. So, the significance of these things of Cheddar Man is that it challenged the assumptions of what the early Brythonics look like. And every time they had done reconstructions prior to the DNA, they always showed them with Mr. Target's skin tone. But his dark skin and blue eyes suggest that the lighter skin evolved later in Britain due to the dietary and environmental adaptations. So DNA analysis of modern British people suggests that about 10% of white British ancestry can be traced back to Cheddar Man's population. That is because there are people with Mr. Target's skin tone who are in direct lineage to Cheddar Man, and the majority of phenotypically white people in Britain are traced back through the Germanic, Norman, Gothic ancestry. Now, that being said, the modern Welsh, now remember when I said they kept getting pushed into Wales, the modern Welsh and their ancestors have the highest, up to 80+% of the Brythonic bloodline, thus Mr. Target from Wales. So they have a lot of that indigenous Brythonic blood. So, hi D. Scott, thank you for being here. Cheddar King is changing the world, yes. So how did they get there? The Mesolithic hunter-gatherers, right? Which is the Natufians, right? Way back when, 10, 20, 30, 40,000 years BCE. These are the earliest humans in Britain after the Ice Age. They were these same Mesolithic hunter-gatherers. They descended from populations that had spread across Europe and the Near East and Anatolia. These people, including Cheddar Man, had dark skin and light eyes, resembling modern groups from the Middle East and North Africa more than later Europeans. And remember, back during the Natufian Age, people in the Middle East and North Africa were Black. They had dark skin. Genetic studies show that their ancestors had migrated from the Near East through the Balkans into Western Europe. Leon said, from the so-called evolution or mutation of the Eve gene. I'm going to hit back on that later. I mean, maybe not the Eve gene, but I'm going to hit back on that later. Okay, the early farmers from Anatolia and Mesopotamia into Britain is confirmed by DNA evidence. It confirms that those Neolithic Britons came from the same population that had spread farming across Europe, originating from the Fertile Crescent or Sumeria, right? Modern Iraq, Syria, and Turkey. They introduced agriculture, megalithic construction like Stonehenge, and new burial customs. By the Iron Age, which is, 800 BC to about 100 of the Common Era, the Britons had fully developed as a distinct group, speaking Brythonic language and practicing Druidic religion. Druidism is very close to Sumerian beliefs. So, who were the Druids. And I'll say are. For a while, probably 10 years ago or so, up to about, gosh, in the last couple years, it was always taught that the Romans had wiped out the Druids, and that has been proven false over time. So, who were the Druids? The Druids were the priestly class, the collegiate people among the ancient Britons. They were responsible for religion, law, medicine, and education. In Wales, they were particularly influential in sacred knowledge, the oral traditions, astronomy, and natural medicine. They acted as judges and advisors to kings. They conducted ceremonies in sacred groves and megalithic sites. And they organized and inspired military resistance against Rome. And we'll talk about that more in a little bit too. They held a deep connection to nature, worshiping sacred trees, rivers, and celestial bodies. So, during the Roman invasion, the Romans saw the Druids as a major threat because the Druids unified the Britons and led anti-Roman revolts. The most infamous attack on the Druids happened in Wales. So the massacre at Ynys which is Anglesey, also called Druid Island. Ynys was the Druidic stronghold of Britain, home to their colleges, their sacred groves, and their rituals. In the year 60 of the Common Era, the Roman governor Suetonius Paulinus led a brutal attack on the Druids of Anglesey. Yes, these were ancient tree huggers. Roman accounts describe Druidic warriors fighting with frenzied resistance while women dressed in black screamed curses at the invaders. The Romans burned the sacred groves, destroyed the Druidic shrines, and slaughtered the Druids in an attempt to wipe out their influence. So some of the oldest Welsh poetry contains pagan imagery, sun worship. Remember where they came from, right? The Sumerians, the Natufians, the Mesopotamians are also the precursors to Kemet and to Kish and to these other places that we know of where there is sun worship, okay? The legend of Taliesin, who was a poet and a magician, reflects the Druidic belief in reincarnation and getting wisdom from nature. So the Mabinogion Wells medieval collection of stories contains Druidic elements, including shapeshifting, prophecy, and nature magic. Do you guys know that you know of a very, very famous Druid? And I'm going to have you think about who that is. See if you can figure out who that is based on what I've been telling you. Auntie says, at my age, I too am an ancient tree hugger. Yes, she is. We love her for it. Characters like Gawain and Cerdiwen show clear links to ancient Druidic wisdom and sorcery. Adrian Hicks says, Merlin. Ding, 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 ding. Merlin. And we'll talk about that, and I will prove that he was actually a person. Okay. So Christianity and the terraforming of Druidry. So as Christianity spread through Wales, it absorbed and tried to replace some of the Druidic traditions, but much like as Christianity spread, it tried to take some positive things to get everybody on board and then demonize what was left over. So it's sort of like, it's okay if we do it, it's not okay if you do it. So Druidic sites were forcibly converted into Christian churches. Old gods and goddesses were bastardized into saints. This is where we get Saint Bridget. She was one of the first. And the sacred wells, the trees, and the groves remained important just in folk history. So the genetic and cultural origins of the ancient Britons trace back to the Fertile Crescent. showing that the hunter gatherers migrated from the Near East into Europe after the Ice Age. The early farmers from Mesopotamia spread agriculture and megalithic traditions to Britain. And the Britons, Britons, were the indigenous people of Britain before the Anglo-Saxon invasion. They spoke the Brythonic languages, which is the ancestor of Welsh, Cornish, and Breton, and they had cultural and genetic ties to other Western European groups. Leon says Lord of the Rings, Woses. Uh, I like Lord of the Rings, and I wonder how much it has to do with some of that Welsh history. Adrian said, I was going to say David Copperfield, but I'm imagining you're wanting to keep it serious today. There's a lot to get through, and this is very important when we start talking bloodlines. And I keep telling you, I'm going to make it all make sense, okay? The Britons are a distinct ethnic group. Now, the UN to this day has the Britons as a distinct ethnicity. Okay, different than the British. Okay, so they are defined by a common ancestry. They descended from a mix of Mesolithic hunter-gatherers, Neolithic farmers, and eventually the Bronze Age Celts came in, and they didn't fight about it. They originally spoke Common Brythonic, which evolved into Welsh, Cornish, and Breton. The pre-Roman tribal societies later forming post-Roman Brythonic kingdoms, which are at Gowanid, Dumnonia, and Strathclyde. And there's a genetic legacy still present in Wales, Cornwall, and a few Scottish populations. And they are classified nationally and globally as a distinct ethnicity. Okay, so to make it very clear, the ancient Britons are the indigenous Brythonic pre-Celts of Britain. The modern Britons, or British people, are a mix of ancient Britons, Anglo-Saxons, Vikings, Normans, and later migrants, okay? The British monarchy is not descended from the indigenous Britons, and we'll get into that when we talk about history. The British monarchy is from the later Germanic or Gothic ruling class established after the Anglo-Saxon conquests. They are Germanic Norman in origin, descending from the Anglo-Saxon, Viking, and Norman conquerors who took over after the fall of Brythonic rule. The monarchy of Britain is Germanic, not Brythonic. Okay, hopefully we made that clear, but I'll do more. Now I'm going to share something else. All right, share screen. Got Cheddarman, Julius Caesar. There we go. All right, let's talk King Arthur. So this is where we're going to get into King Arthur. The earliest references to King Arthur come from Welsh and some other Celtic sources. He was a real warlord, and this is based on several historical documents. Okay, so the earliest Welsh references to Arthur is an early Welsh poem that mentions that a warrior is greater than Arthur. That's the first one. And so to make a reference like that in a poem, that this warrior is greater than Arthur, means that Arthur was already a legend. Everybody would know who he is. So if I say he's greater than Arthur, you know who Arthur is, right? So he was already a legend, right? In the Historia Brittonium, describes Arthur as a war chief who fought 12 battles against the Saxons, including the famous Battle of Badon. In the Annales Cambriae, right, and this is from the 10th century, records Arthur's victories at Badon and his death at Camlon, and his death in 537 of the Common Era. His role in Welsh history is huge, okay? Arthur was a war leader, not a king, okay? He was a war leader of the Britons, and if you remember, the Knights of the Round Table, right? So it was a very equitable, egalitarian society, where everyone had a voice. It was not, one dude telling everybody what to do. So he was a war leader of the Britons, uniting the Welsh and the Cornish tribes against the invading Anglo-Saxons. It was the last great stand of the Britons before England became dominated by the Germanic rulers. In Welsh stories, Arthur appears as kind of a magical hero and defender of Britain rather than a medieval king. Okay. There is a collection of Welsh stories called the Mabinogion. It's really hard to say. And that contains the earliest Arthurian tales. It shows him as a warrior king with supernatural allies. Merlin, okay? And Colwich and Olwen, one of the earliest Arthurian stories, features Arthur as a hero leading warriors on a quest. In The Dream of Rhonabwy, shows Arthur as a figure tied to fate and prophecy. In the Peredur, which is the early Welsh version of Percival, it contains elements of the Holy Grail legend, but with a Welsh twist, right? In the Bedouin, a one-handed warrior later transformed into an English knight in other stories. That was one of his companions. And then Kay, who was a giant slaying, shape-shifting warrior in Welsh tales. And then Merdyd, which is Merlin. So Merdyd was a Welsh druid and prophet based on Merdyd Wellet, who is a historical druidic bard. Real guy, okay? But he's practicing druidism, right? And so because the druids were advisors to kings, when we look at these ancient medieval tales and there's always, the king goes to the wizard, there's a reason for that. Because, monarchs would want to go get you a druid to help you out with stuff, okay? So Arthur's legend is deeply tied to Welsh's geography, where many places have connections to him. So in Caerleon, which is Newport, South Wales, is where they said Arthur's court was. Okay. Now, it was later taken over as a base of Roman cavalry leaders. And then Mount Snowdon, which is Irwadaf. Legends say that Arthur fought a giant there, and the peak is named after his enemy. Llywelyn, which is the Lake of the Fairies in Snowdonia, is said to be the Lake of Avalon from the stories, where Excalibur was forged and returned. And then Bedded Arthur, which is Arthur's grave in Preseli Hills, is a stone circle said to be Arthur's final resting place. So, unlike later English and French legends, Welsh tales don't say that Arthur is actually dead. Instead, he is in rest and will return when Britain needs him. So Annales Cambriae records that Arthur died at the Battle of Camlon, possibly fighting the Saxons. But in Welsh legend, he was mortally wounded and taken to Avalon. Okay. They view Arthur as the once and future king. So it was after his death that they called him king. Welsh prophecy says that Arthur will one day return to restore the land of the Britons and reclaim Britain. This idea comes from Welsh resistance myths, especially during times of English oppression. So, after the Norman conquest, so I'm going to go historical here, but that story, King Arthur was stolen and bastardized. This is actually, Arthur is actually about opposition to the Germanic Norman English invaders. So, which I find interesting to read those stories after knowing that. So, after the Norman conquest in 1066, the English rulers co-opted Arthur for their own purposes, right? Geoffrey of Monmouth in 1136 wrote Historia Regum Britanniae, which turned Arthur into a medieval king. The Normans and the Plantagenets used Arthur as a symbol of England, completely erasing his Welsh roots. And then King Edward I in 1301 made his son the Prince of Wales, falsely claiming Arthur's legacy, because remember, after his death, they called him once and future King of Britain, right? So when King Edward I made his son the Prince of Wales, it claimed Arthur's legacy to justify the English rule over Wales. And to this day, that monarchy has their oldest son as the Prince of Wales. Remember? All right, so for the Welsh, Arthur's always been a symbol of defiance against the English rule. In Owen Glendower in the 1400s, who was the last true Prince of Wales, invoked Arthur's name in his rebellion against England. These, for Arthur, the once and future king, right? Modern Welsh nationalism embraces Arthur as a figure of their lost sovereignty, because they're still not sovereign today. Okay, so the true Arthur was Welsh and fought against the English. Adrian says, oh, damn Plantagenets, isn't it always? As a side note, did you guys know that every US president, including Trump, Obama, all of them, except with the one exception, Martin Van Buren hasn't been proven, but that they all come from one Plantagenet king in their ancestry. They all go back to that one Plantagenet king. Isn't it interesting? Leon says, the framework of this myth and the king, interesting, very similar. Yeah. So the original Arthur was a Brythonic war leader, not an English king, never was an English king. His true roots lie in Wales, in the struggles of the indigenous Britons against the Saxons and the later English domination. Today, Welsh tradition keeps the real Arthur alive, separate from the French and English medieval rewritings that stole his legacy. So let's talk about the Germanic invaders, the Goths, and how they treated these indigenous peoples who came from Mesopotamia. So after the Romans withdrew from Britain, in about 410 of the Common Era, the native Britons, the Brythonics, were left to defend their lands against now invading Angles and Saxons. So we finally got the Romans out after hundreds of years, and here come the Angles and the Saxons. And those Angles and Saxons came from modern-day Germany and Denmark, okay? The Anglo-Saxons pushed the Britons westward, farther into Wales, Cornwall, and the southern tip of Scotland. The Britons, who were later called the Welsh, the Cornish, and the Cumbrians, but remember the Cumbrians were wiped out, that they became a marginalized and besieged people. Welsh resistance persisted for centuries under leaders like Arthur and later Welsh kings and princes. So after William the Conqueror, a Norman, a Goth, originally from Viking stock, took England in 1066. Finally, it took him a while, right? from the 410 to 1066 of fighting, okay? He took He took England in 1066 and they targeted Wales for their expansion. The Norman lords invaded Wales and built castles to control the Britons. Okay. The Marcher lords, the Anglo-Norman rulers, those are the Marcher lords, enforced brutal feudal rule over the Welsh. Revolts by Welsh leaders like Owain Gwynedd, Gwynedd in the 1170s and Llywelyn the Great in the 1200s were temporarily successful, but ultimately failed. In 1282, King Edward I of England, now remember Germanic rule, right? Already showed that, launched a full-scale war against Wales. Enough is enough. Killing Llywelyn ap Gruffydd, the last native prince of Wales, Llywelyn ap Gruffydd, remember that name, and annexing Wales under English rule. The Statute of Rhuddlan of 1284 officially placed Wales under English control. The Welsh laws were replaced by English common law. The Welsh nobility was stripped of power, and Edward I built castles to keep Wales under occupation. And remember, Edward named his son the Prince of Wales. Edward forced Welsh laborers to build castles like Caernarfon, Conway, and Harlech under harsh conditions. Edward I declared his English-born son as the Prince of Wales, a title stolen from the native rulers of Wales. This title continues to be held by the heir to the British throne today. This was an intentional act of humiliation against the Welsh people. The English erased Welsh sovereignty, ensuring no Briton, Briton, or Welsh leader would rule again. After Wales was conquered, the Welsh became second-class citizens in their own land. So we have the Laws in Wales Act of 1535, which fully annexed Wales into England. The Welsh people were banned from holding office unless they fully assimilated into the English customs. The Welsh language was suppressed and English became the official language. Welsh workers were exploited in industries like mining, farming, and castle building. Okay, well, and I'm going to talk about the transatlantic slave trade because there was some stuff going on in Wales during that time. Okay, while much of the transatlantic slave trade focuses on African enslavement, and there's no way to take away the absolute devastation and disgusting treatment of human beings, of Africans during that time. I'm just going to talk about what was going on in Wales during that time. So the Welsh workers were subjected to forced labor in industries tied to that system because, again, England annexed them, put them under feudal power, and they're second-class citizens. So Welsh iron, copper, and coal were essential to making the chains, weapons, and ships for the transatlantic slave trade. Many Welsh miners and metal workers were forced into harsh, unpaid labor. Many were sent as indentured servants into the colonies to set them up. Welsh prisoners and the poor were sent to the Caribbean and North America under indentured servitude, a system that resulted in lifelong servitude. Welsh workers were used on plantations as field laborers and in the mines in North America. The Welsh port city of Cardiff played a role in supplying materials for ships involved in the slave trade, and Welsh workers were forced into shipbuilding and metalwork and also clothing production, supporting Britain's colonial expansion. So during the 17th and 18th centuries, individuals from England, Wales, Scotland, and Ireland who were convicted of crimes, again, all second-class citizens, were sentenced to penal transport to various British colonies. So for the Welsh convicts, this typically meant being sent to specific areas in North America. Okay. So prior to the American Revolution, convicts were, so this started in about 1610. Those convicts were transported to colonies along the eastern seaboard, including Virginia, Maryland, and the Carolinas. Following the loss of the American colonies, the revolution, so after 1776, um, transportation of those Welsh convicts shifted to Australia into a penal colony they called New South Wales, which was in Tasmania, and they called it Van Diemen's Land, right? And some areas in Western Australia as well. Transportation was a common sentence for various offenses, ranging from petty theft to more serious crimes, and convicts were often put to labor upon arrival in the colonies. So, I'll talk about one of the colonies when I talk about myself. Okay. So after the industrial era, Wales faced ongoing English oppression. Okay. So in schools, Welsh children are punished for speaking their native language. And there was a wooden sign in every school called the Welsh Not, N-O-T, Welsh Not, which is everywhere. Welsh Not. You are not to speak Cymraeg. Okay. This led to a decline in Welsh fluency and an attempt to eradicate the Brythonic language. Many Welsh workers were trapped in poverty, working in English-owned mines and factories. Adrian says, and we know what happened, though, to the Tasmanians after that. Absolutely. Welsh communities were deliberately kept underdeveloped while English elites controlled industry and the profits. The profits always went uphill. Despite centuries of English oppression, Welsh identity, language, and culture survived. The Welsh Language Act of 1993 restored some legal rights to the Welsh language. So the Welsh are allowed to speak Cymraeg, which is the modern Welsh, which is the same as ancient Brythonic. And they are allowed to teach it in school as well. And then devolution in 1997 allowed Wales to regain partial self-governance. It's sort of like your governors can be Welsh, though it is politically and financially controlled by the UK still to this day. Welsh independence movements continue to push for full separation from England. So from the Anglo-Saxon and Goth conquests of the Britons to the exploitation of Welsh labor, England's treatment of Wales has been one of conquest, forced servitude, cultural suppression, and economic exploitation. Hi, Inspired Truth. Thank you for being here. Despite this, the Welsh identity has endured, proving that the Britons, the true indigenous people of Britain, could not be erased. So thank you for listening to that. I'm going to do a little bonus to tie in again. Even though genetic evidence, archaeological evidence, everything says they came from Mesopotamia and Sumeria, these ancient Brythonic people, I'm going to show you something interesting. Let me stop that. There's so many screen shares. There we go. Okay, so we know that Mesopotamia and Sumeria is around Iraq, Iran, that area. So what they have there are these stone megalithic structures, right? Hundreds of them showing these. Now, this is where I'm going to get back to what Leon was talking about, dates, right? Because they'll say some of these circles are like 7,000-year-old, and then they'll say, well, these other circles that came after those circles are 9,000 years old. So they're getting the dates all funky. But so we know about these stone circles. Then we've all heard of Stonehenge, right? So I don't need to show a picture of Stonehenge, big stone circles, right? Which are megalithic structures, okay? But these same megalithic stone circles are found in Egypt, Senegal, Gambia, in the Levant area at large, okay? All from these same folks. Then we know about Stonehenge, but guess where else we find these large megalithic circles? Brittany, which is where the Bretons went, right? Also in Spain, north side of Spain, where the Britons went, Romania, which will make sense another time about the Romani people, India, China, Brazil, and Bolivia. Now, all of these are places that the Sumerians spread to: Romania, India, China, Brazil, and Bolivia, right? But guess where else there's a megalithic structure? Let's stop that. Something we just found. There it is. Oh. Lake Michigan. And they're saying 9,000 years old. Okay, I want to see. And they're calling it a Stonehenge. Okay, is there any talk about the material? They have, yes, they have carvings and writings on them. This was found in Lake Michigan. So it's going to be interesting when all this stuff gets tied together and these big megalithic stone circles that all come back to Mesopotamia and the Sumerians. That's going to be interesting. How does Lake Michigan play into this? Because I thought, people weren't here. So just a little bonus for you guys. So get excited about this history for a particular reason, because this is my history. I have family trees dating back to the year, well, I have one that dates back to the year 10 and one that dates back to 90 AD, and Wells. I have an ancestor who was convicted of a petty land dispute, who was sentenced here in 1590. What he found was there were towns that were set up, and these towns consisted of convicts, like himself, Native Americans, and free Black people. And one of the stories that is interesting in my family heritage, which is on a different computer, the receipts for that, is that he married a free Black woman named Medica. Now, in the census, they didn't do census, they did countings. She was put down as Medica Smith. We can find no history on her whatsoever. However, in this town, in this settlement of convicts, Native Americans, and free Black people, again, remember, this is pre-1619. Okay, this is just when it's supposed to be a penal colony and wildness everywhere. Every time they would come to the settlement and do counts, they would write letters back. So this is in the Chamberlain letters, not knowing what to do about all of the mixed race or mulatto, what they call mulatto children. Because they hadn't yet made the laws about how do we decide who's free and who's not, and blah, blah, blah. They were still using convicts for a lot of setting up shop. So eventually, the monarchy, I think it was Elizabeth, said that the children, the mixed race children, had to be in indentured servitude. Okay, since we can't really enslave them and we can't let them be free, because God forbid you let brown people be free, they said they had to be in indentured servitude. So, what these families did, which pissed off the crown, was they all traded kids. So, instead of using your own kids to help you with, your daily work, your farming, your homestead, your everything, you would put them in indentured servitude with your neighbors, whichever one was white, be it the husband or the wife. So, excuse me. So, I would put my kids in indentured servitude with, the neighbors, and they would take their kids and put them in indentured servitude with my family, with whichever one of us was white. So everybody was just trading kids for the day. And then all the kids went home to their parents. So instead of helping your parents, you just helped this other family and their kids came over and helped you. And so this was how they worked out that problem. And it pissed off the crown something fierce. And eventually that settlement got dispersed. But it was, by the time it was dispersed, it was pretty big. And it was in Maryland and Virginia area. So those people got dispersed. My lineage went to Kentucky to get away. And as we know what happened in 1619 and beyond, there was no getting away anywhere. So in my lineage, we're all told from day one that we are Welsh and what that means. And even though it was always called metaphysics, that druidic, magical influence has always been there. We've always been taught. We've been taught about our ancestry and the metaphysics of our ancestry. And so all of that is very, very important to me. And so that's something I wanted to share with you guys, that these are things that I've always known. And I think the important part for me is not to say, oh, look, I have Black ancestors, not like that at all. I think it's in looking at, on an even bigger scale, that you have a line of humans that came out of Central Africa, that came out of Mesopotamia. And when they were pushed out of Mesopotamia into the valley, and then ended up being pushed back into Central Africa, these human beings who have been proving to not be Neanderthals is the lineage from which I come. And there is another lineage of people who come from a Gothic ancestry, who come from a Neanderthal ancestry. And so it's nice to have common ancestry with certain people and to understand where you come from, who you are, and what you believe in. So understanding those things and what your peoples have been through is very, 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 very important. Oh, Auntie says my Welsh ancestors are proud. Thank you. So we've always known we're Welsh. We've always talked about it. We've always talked about that Welsh history. I also have, I'll show you guys something. It's pretty interesting. Stop that. Just in case you want to, if anybody's interested about this. Not that. I think it's this one. Yeah. So this one. No, come on, load. Okay. So what you'll see is I was part of, let me back up. So when they found Mr. Target in Wells, there was this archaeological and genetic push to find people who were Brythonic. Now, for me, I have a little over 70% of Brythonic DNA. So still very high. People in Wells, it's 80% and higher. So they're still holding that ethnicity. I am on some no, I'm not going to be flippant. I am on a scroll with the UN as being an indigenous Brythonic. So that's cool. I get pride out of that. But um, part of getting on that scroll was this archaeological study that they did with DNA to match. Okay. So they took these Roman gladiators that they found in York. I had 5 genetic matches, and 4 of them were Brythonic, so that was interesting. And then, in around, ancient Britain and Stonehenge, so Cheddar Man, um, I have a linkage to him, so about a third more than other people who place him on their lineage. I'm about a third closer to him. I'm not a direct descendant as Mr. Target, but we are from the same line. And then one that I find really interesting from they're guessing 1515 BC, which is they call the Golden Boy. He was found at Stonehenge in a proper burial. So again, it shows me a third closer than others who have him in their lineage. However, um, I am 92% the same DNA as the Golden Boy of Amesbury from Stonehenge. So I find that super interesting. Hopefully you guys, oh, I'm not sure you guys could see that because it opened a new screen. Darn it. And I wasn't looking at the comments. I will switch screens and show you guys. Stop that. Present. Oh, it's not showing me the page. Well, darn. Because I opened in another screen. I'm so sorry. Thank you, Adric. He said Maggie was already family without the proof. I don't know why, but that makes me a little teary and very happy. Thank you. Okay, so that is why it was important for me to utilize the Brythonics as an example of when we're talking about the Goths and we're talking about these bloodlines, that there is a bloodline of people who came from the Levant, from Mesopotamia, from Central Africa, the Natufians, all of these people, the precursors to Kemet, to Kish, to Egypt, to the pyramids, to all those things. Some of those people, probably the ones with the light colored eyes, and it's very sunny over there, came around. And we're here, we're in Europe, we're in the area and settled and flourishing. And then for whatever reason, the Goths, the Germanic people, pushed them out, took them over. But we're still alive. We're still here. And much like how the Scottish people understand that their ancestry comes from Scotia, from Egypt, we understand that our ancestry comes from Mesopotamia in the ancient Druids who continued that tradition. So I appreciate you guys. Next weekend, we are going to talk about those Natufians and how they spread into Mesopotamia at Mount Ararat, which is, they think, if Noah was a real person, I think the word Noah is based on a specific person, that may have been where he landed after the flood. So remember, as the ice age is melting, floods, tidal waves, lots of stuff going on. I mean, this is why we have the Sahara Desert, right? Because It was very lush. It was very green. It was very much an empire of some very working, prosperous people. Big tidal waves, lots of salt water, killed everything. That's why it's a desert now. So we have them moving from Mount Ararat after some people came in. And this is also where we get the story of the Anunnaki, because they worshipped God Anu, and the people were the Anunnaki. This is also where we get the Sumerians' kings list. This was the very first king who worshipped Anu, was King Adam, the first man. So we'll talk about the Natufians and their spread into Mesopotamia and Sumeria, because it's all very, very interesting. And it may be part of shared history. Your history may go back to, Central Africa, Mesopotamia, Sumeria during those times, to the Natufians. And some of the Natufian language still persists to today in Africa, which is so cool, because this is the oldest known community of people who started doing communal activities together, like burial rites and rules and laws and all that kind of stuff. Leon says the census words that are dangerous, black and white, is the destruction of history and lines. I totally agree, because like I will tell some people, when you put a line between black and white, that's when it's a problem. If I was to say, well, Cheddar Man can't be my ancestor because I'm white, that doesn't make sense, right? If the Natufians are the precursors to the Mesopotamians, and the Mesopotamians are the precursors to the Brythonics, and the Brythonics are the Welsh people, and that's me, then that's my whole line. So at one point, my line was dark black. At one point, my line was a lighter black with blue eyes. And at some point, here we are with lots of freckles and a ruddy complexion. That's what we got. That's all we got. Lots of freckles and red blotches. So, and a little bit of vitiligo type stuff. White freckles. We used to always call them white freckles. Just little spots where there's just no pigment whatsoever. So that's what we're left with. But my bigger thing was expanding on Goths and the Gothic Empire and where they are and what they're doing to this day, even in their area of Europe. So I almost forgot to mention, there's also in those Chamberlain letters, so the Chamberlain letters start in 1597, and is John Chamberlain writing to a noble. I can't remember his name. Oh, got the Chamberlain letter. Anyway, he talks about kings from other areas going to meet with and to try to get access to and permission for things from the emperor in Germany. Isn't that interesting? Hold on, I will find them. Anyway, so they talk about always trying to get permission, always talking to the emperor and the emperors in Germany. And they do not mean the Pope, because he references the Pope. And they don't mean the specific kings and queens, because he talks about the kings and queens, but he does often reference the emperor in Germany. We have so many things. Oh, here we go. So the Chamberlain letters, it's these. Looks like this. So they're the letters of John Chamberlain. They were writing to Sir Dudley. Who was he writing to? Sir Dudley is all he ever calls him. So I'm sure it's in here somewhere. Dudley Carleton. Okay. So it's him writing about world events and gossiping and whatnot. And, you read the letters, and it's highly likely he had a bit of a crush on Sir Dudley. So interesting. So if you guys are interested in those, they start in 1597 and talk about everything that's going on in the realm, right? But you will see that he refers to everybody trying to get permission for stuff from the emperor in Germany. Did you guys ever learn that there was an emperor in Germany that was calling the shots? Interesting, huh? Interesting. Okay. Leon says, that we already said that. Leon says, now I'm getting really confused about World War I and World War II. Just remember sometimes, how do I say this? Sometimes to cull a population, you have the same people on both sides. Sometimes. So if you go back and look at some of the information from World War I with fresh eyes, you might see some things. Okay. Now, you could also understand more once I do the show on who are the Khazarians. That might give you a little bit of a keener version or keener eyes too. So I appreciate y'all being here. We're going to talk about the Natufians next week. We also have Pivot Point Wednesday coming up. I am going to put a video out about all of the banned words under the Trump administration. So that one will be coming out soon. Hopefully, if you can't join us this Wednesday for the Book of Knowledge, then I hope you can join for the Natufians. I am changing up the format for the Book of Knowledge. I don't think it's helpful to anyone for me to just read the book, even though I just literally was not wanting to leave anything out for people. When I pre-recorded it and I'm listening at the same time, it was boring. So I'm sorry I put any of you through that. So I'm changing up the format a little bit to actually make it more interesting and to get a little deeper into the topic, which I think is the important part. So we'll be reading some from it. We'll kind of hit the highlights, but not read that whole esoteric thing of just big word jammed next to big word. We don't got to do that. So hopefully you can join Wednesday. If not, I will see you guys next Sunday. Everybody have a great rest of your day. I love you. I miss you. You're my favorite. Please like the video if you haven't already. It really helps the algorithm to know what kind of things you like. Share where you think it's appropriate, especially to someone who you think needs to hear it. And don't forget to check out some of the wilder Pivot Point Wednesday shows. And last, don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already, especially if you want to break down complex concepts that make the esoteric not so teric, helping you on your journey to become your most authentic self. By subscribing, you'll join a community that thrives on curiosity and growth, and you'll never miss out on insights and some wild discussions. Let's uncover the universe together. Bye.